Hi, I'm Jake, and I saw a seasoned chief engineer tell a whole platoon their friends were going to die because a multi-million-dollar armored vehicle was a lost cause. He stood there, covered in grease and arrogance, while a 12-year-old orphan boy stood silently in the shadows, holding the answer in his pocket. It's funny how the people with the most power are often the most blind. Have you ever felt completely invisible, even when you knew you had the solution? Everyone was desperately searching. Before I tell you how that kid used a simple piece of wire to bring that engine back from the dead, just comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. Trust me, you won't want to miss the look on that engineer's face when the bulldog roared back to life. The air in the fob was thick enough to chew, a nasty cocktail of sand, cordite, and pure, unfiltered fear. Mortar rounds were landing just outside the wire, close enough to make the ground tremble under our boots. Over the radio, we could hear Sergeant Miller's men pinned down, taking fire, and running low on everything. Their voices were getting frantic, pleading for extraction. The bulldog, our only MRAP tough enough to get them out, sat there like a useless metal tomb. Every second it remained silent was another second those guys got closer to not coming home at all. It wasn't just a vehicle, it was their lifeline, and the damn thing was dead. The frustration was a physical weight, pressing down on all of us. Chief Warrant Officer Davis was supposed to be the best. He'd arrived with a chest full of ribbons and a condescending attitude, talking about diagnostics and proprietary software like it was scripture. He and his team of mechanics had been swarming the bulldog for an hour, their laptops plugged into every port, their faces illuminated by glowing green text. They never really looked at the engine, not in the way a real mechanic does. They looked at what their computers told them. Finally, Davis threw his wrench on the ground with a loud clang that made everyone jump. "Catastrophic fuel injector pump failure," he announced to the whole bay. "It's done. Impossible to fix here. The mission is a scrub." He said it with such finality, like he was a god declaring a man's fate. The silence that followed his words was heavier than any explosion. You could see the hope drain from everyone's faces. Sergeant Miller just stood there, his jaw tight, his eyes staring at the silent radio as if he could will his men to safety. That's when I first really noticed the kid, Leo. He was one of the local orphans who hung around the base, a quiet boy with old eyes who mostly just stayed out of the way. We'd give him food sometimes, but mostly he was just there, part of the dusty landscape. In that moment of collective despair, he was utterly invisible. No one looked at him. No one acknowledged him. He was just a ghost in the corner of a very real nightmare. But then Leo moved. He didn't make a sound. He just slipped out from the shadows where he'd been watching, moving past the dejected engineers who were already packing up their advanced tools. He walked right up to the massive, silent engine of the bulldog and placed his small, bare hand flat against the engine block. He just stood there, completely still, as if he were listening to a secret. Sergeant Miller, whose face was a mask of grief and rage, finally saw him. His voice was rough, scraped raw by desperation. "What is it, kid?" he barked, his voice cracking. "You see a ghost in there?" He wasn't asking for help. He was just lashing out at the nearest thing. Leo didn't even flinch. He didn't look at Miller or the angry engineers. He just closed his eyes. It was the strangest thing I'd ever seen. In the middle of all that chaos, with men dying just a few hundred yards away, this little kid was meditating over a dead engine. He started running his small, grimy fingers along a secondary fuel line, a thin pipe, buried under layers of other components that the engineers had ignored. Chief Davis let out a loud, contemptuous scoff. "Get him out of here," he snapped. "We don't have time for this." But Miller, with absolutely nothing left to lose, shot Davis a look so full of fury it could have stopped a tank. "Shut up," Miller growled. "Let him look." There was a strange, tense energy in that moment. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was more like the dead silence before a lightning strike. Miller, a man who lived and breathed by the book, was now betting the lives of his men on the whim of a child he barely knew. You could see the internal war on his face. Every bit of his training screamed that this was insane, a waste of what little time they had left. But then he'd glance at the radio and you could see the other side of the coin. Complete and utter desperation. The experts had given up. The book had failed them. What else was there? Chief Davis looked like he was about to have an aneurysm, his face turning a deep shade of red under the harsh bay lights. He saw this as a direct challenge to his authority, an insult to his rank and expertise. Leo seemed oblivious to the storm brewing around him. He was in his own world, a world made of metal, oil, and vibrations. He ran his fingertips over the secondary fuel line with a delicacy that was almost unnerving, his brow furrowed in deep concentration. The engineers, who had been standing around looking defeated, now watched with a mixture of pity and scorn. They had their ruggedized laptops and digital pressure gauges. This kid had his bare hands. To them, it must have looked like some kind of primitive ritual, like a shaman trying to heal a sick animal by touching it. Leo would occasionally stop, tap a specific spot with his knuckle, and then press his ear against the cold steel, listening for a sound that only he could hear. It was a language none of the rest of us understood, and that made them deeply uncomfortable. The whispers started soon after. A couple of the younger engineers were snickering behind their hands, muttering things like, "What's next? He's going to read its fortune? And maybe we should just get him some crayons and paper." Chief Davis didn't even bother to whisper. "This is a complete farce," he said, loud enough for Miller and half the bay to hear. "We're losing men out there, and you're letting a street urchin play mechanic on a piece of classified military hardware. This is going on my report. Sergeant, every second we waste here is on you." The injustice of it was thick in the air. He wasn't just dismissing Leo, he was actively trying to humiliate Miller for even allowing this to happen, ensuring that if it failed, the blame would be squarely on the sergeant's shoulders. I just stood there, holding a useless fire extinguisher, feeling a knot of shame tighten in my stomach. I was a soldier. I was trained to trust the chain of command, to believe in the experts like Davis. But watching him so puffed up with his own importance while his fellow soldiers were calling for help made me sick. And then there was Leo. This small, silent kid, showing more focus and dedication than the entire engineering team combined. Part of me screamed that this was a lost cause, that we should be preparing for the worst, but another part, a quieter part, was rooting for him. I wanted him to be right. I wanted him to wipe that smug, condescending look right off Chief Davis's face. I wanted to believe that sometimes the answer doesn't come from a manual. After a few minutes that felt like an eternity, Leo stopped. His hand rested on a small, almost invisible valve tucked away beneath a tangle of hoses. It was covered in a thick cake of sand and grime, a part so insignificant that you wouldn't even notice it unless you were specifically looking for it. He turned to Miller, his eyes wide and serious. He didn't have the words in English to explain the complex mechanics of a vapor lock or a pressure differential. He just pointed, his small finger jabbing at the grimy valve. "No fuel," he said, his voice a quiet rasp. "Here. Blocked. Like when water pipe has rock inside. No good." It was so simple, so fundamentally different from the catastrophic pump failure diagnosis we'd been given. It was a problem you could touch. Chief Davis strode over, his boots echoing on the concrete floor. He leaned in, glanced at where Leo was pointing, and then he just threw his head back and laughed. It wasn't a small chuckle. It was a loud, booming, derisive laugh that filled the entire maintenance bay. It was the cruelest sound I had ever heard. "A clog?" he bellowed, looking around at his team as if to share the joke. "The kid thinks a $100,000 fuel injection system, the most sophisticated diesel engine in the fleet, is being stopped by a little bit of sand. Son, that's adorable." He patted Leo on the head in a gesture of pure condescension. "Go find your mother. The adults have work to do." The words hung in the air, dripping with venom and arrogance, and you could see Leo just shrink. Just then, the radio crackled to life again. It was Miller's corporal. "Sergeant, we're taking heavy contact. 2 men down. We can't hold this position much longer. Where the hell is that bulldog?" The voice was strained, cracking with panic and pain. That was it. That was the spark. Something in Sergeant Miller snapped. He spun around and got so close to Chief Davis that their noses were almost touching. "You said it was a lost cause," Miller growled, his voice dangerously low and steady. "You said it's impossible to fix. So if it's already broken and my men are dying, what possible harm can there be in trying the kid's stupid, adorable little idea? You are relieved, Chief. Get out of the way now." It wasn't a request. It was an order, raw and absolute, born from the deepest pits of desperation. Chief Davis stood there, his face a thundercloud of pure, unadulterated fury. For a second, I thought he was going to swing at Miller. You just don't talk to a chief warrant officer like that, especially not in front of his own men and a platoon sergeant. But Miller didn't even blink. He held Davis's gaze, and in that stare you could see the fire that had been banked down by protocol and procedure was now raging out of control. The other engineers just shuffled their feet, looking anywhere but at the two men. The power in that bay had shifted, completely and irrevocably. It no longer belonged to the man with the highest rank. It belonged to the man with the most desperation. Davis finally took a step back, a look of utter disgust on his face, and for the first time since he'd arrived, he was silent. Miller turned away from the fuming engineer and knelt down, bringing himself to Leo's eye level. The entire chaotic, noisy maintenance bay seemed to shrink until it was just the two of them. "Okay, son," Miller said, his voice softer now, but still tight with urgency. "Show me, what do you need?" He was all in. He had crossed his Rubicon and was now placing the fate of his men squarely in the hands of this child. Leo didn't point to the massive tool chests or the diagnostic kits. He just reached into the pocket of his tattered trousers and pulled out a small, grimy piece of wire, maybe 6 inches long, bent into a hook at one end. It was the kind of thing you'd use to clean a pipe. Nothing more. He held it up, his small hand, steady, and simply pointed back at the valve. That was it. That was his tool. The answer to a multi-million-dollar problem was a piece of junk wire. While Leo worked, a strange quiet fell over our corner of the bay. He was so focused, his small fingers moving with a surgeon's precision, as he carefully inserted the wire into the tiny valve opening. He scraped and twisted, and you could hear the faint, gritty sound of compacted sand being dislodged. It was an intimate, delicate process happening, on the side of a monstrous machine built for pure violence. The only other sounds were the distant, rhythmic thud of enemy mortars and the increasingly desperate calls from the radio, which someone had thankfully turned down but not off. Each crackle of static was a reminder that the clock was ticking, that men were bleeding out there in the sand. A few of the other soldiers had gathered around, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and the faintest glimmer of impossible hope. They were watching a miracle or a fool's errand, and nobody knew which. Chief Davis couldn't stand it. He had retreated to the edge of the group, but his anger was a palpable force. "This is a circus, Miller," he suddenly shouted, his voice echoing in the tense silence. "You are violating at least a dozen maintenance protocols. When we lose those men, this will be on your head. I'm documenting every second of this farce for your court-martial." He was trying to reassert his authority, to use the threat of military law to stop this madness. He wasn't just angry, he was terrified. Not for the men in the field, but for his own reputation. If this kid was right, it meant his entire world of diagnostics, training and expertise was a lie. He needed this to fail, just to prove he was right all along. It was a disgusting thought, but you could see it plainly on his face. Miller didn't even turn to look at him. He just raised a hand and pointed at 2 of his own men, big guys from his platoon, who had been waiting for orders. "Richards, Peterson," he said, his voice flat and cold. "Please escort the chief to the command tent. Make sure he gets a bottle of water and stays there until I come for him. He seems stressed." The 2 soldiers moved immediately, their faces grim. They flanked Davis, who looked absolutely stunned. He sputtered, trying to protest, but one look at the faces of the 2 grunts told him it was useless. They weren't engineers under his command. They were Miller's men, loyal to their sergeant above all else. They gently but firmly guided the fuming chief warrant officer out of the bay, leaving behind a silence that was now filled with nothing but raw, unyielding tension. With the distraction gone, all eyes returned to Leo. He had finished with the wire and now held a small, smooth rock in his palm. He started tapping the housing of the valve with it. It wasn't a random banging. It was a specific, rhythmic pattern. Tap, 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 pause, tap, tap. It was the kind of thing you see an old man do to a stubborn lawnmower, a piece of folk wisdom passed down through generations. To the remaining engineers, who were watching from a safe distance, it must have looked like pure witchcraft. They were trained to use torque wrenches and follow schematics, and here was a boy tapping a critical fuel line with a rock, as if he were trying to wake a sleeping spirit. He was completely absorbed in the task, his ear pressed against the metal again, listening for a change that only he could perceive. After a few more rhythmic taps, Leo stopped. He let the rock fall from his hand with a soft clink on the concrete floor. He stood up, wiped his grimy hands on his pants, and looked directly at Sergeant Miller. The entire bay, every soldier, every mechanic, every single person who had gathered to watch this impossible scene held their breath. The distant sound of gunfire seemed to fade away. It felt like the whole world had gone silent, waiting. Leo didn't smile. His expression was as serious as it had been from the start. He just gave a single, small, definitive nod. Then, in a voice so quiet it was almost swallowed by the cavernous space, he whispered one word that carried the weight of a dozen men's lives. Now. Sergeant Miller didn't move for a full second. He just stared at Leo, this small, dusty boy who had just given him an order. It was as if he was seeing him for the first time, not as a nuisance or a charity case, but as an equal. The weight of that single word, now, hung in the air, heavier than any command he had ever received on the battlefield. He finally broke the stare, his face set like stone, and turned towards the towering MRAP without a word. Every eye in the bay followed his deliberate, heavy steps as he walked towards the driver's side door. It wasn't just a walk from point A to point B. It was a march towards either the biggest failure of his career or the most unlikely salvation his men could ever hope for. There was no middle ground left. The silence was absolute. It was a vacuum sucking all the air and noise out of the hangar. Even the distant crump of mortars seemed to have faded away, as if the entire war was holding its breath to see what would happen next. I could feel my own heart hammering against my ribs, each beat a painful thud in the stillness. We were all frozen, a tableau of desperate soldiers, watching our sergeant climb into the belly of a dead beast, putting his faith in the hands of a child. Prophet. The remaining engineers stood clustered together, their arms crossed, their faces a perfect mask of professional skepticism. You could see it in their eyes. They weren't just expecting it to fail. They were counting on it. Failure would validate them. It would restore the order that this whole chaotic, emotional scene had shattered. Miller heaved himself up into the driver's seat, the metal groaning under his weight. He sat there for a moment, his big hands gripping the steering wheel. So tightly his knuckles were white. He was looking at the dashboard, at the array of dead gauges and dark screens that the experts had declared were tombstones. His hand moved slowly, deliberately, towards the ignition key, which was still in the slot where the last engineer had left it. His fingers hovered over it a millimeter away from contact. In that tiny gap lay everything, the lives of his men, his own career, the smug certainty of Chief Davis, and the quiet, unwavering confidence of the boy standing below. It was the longest second of my entire life, watching that hand tremble ever so slightly with the weight of it all. I saw two of the younger engineers exchange a look. It was a quick, almost imperceptible glance, but it was filled with so much condescending certainty. One of them had a tiny smirk playing on his lips, the kind of look that says, "I can't wait to see this." They had already written the end of this story in their minds. The crazy sergeant, broken by stress, listens to a local kid and makes a fool of himself. It was a story they could tell back at the main base, a cautionary tale about why you always trust the tech and the manual, not your gut. Their arrogance was a poison in the air, making the tension even more unbearable. They weren't just observers, they were vultures, waiting for the final definitive proof that they were right and that this desperate hope was nothing but a pathetic joke. Just as Miller's fingers were about to touch the key, the radio, which had been turned low, crackled with a burst of static so loud it made us all jump. Then came the voice, shredded by panic. "Sergeant, they're on top of us. They're at the west wall. Grenades, we're out of ammo. For God's sake, if you're coming, come now, this is it." The transmission cut out into a horrifying hiss of static. That was it, the final push off the cliff. There was no more time for doubt, for hesitation, for weighing the odds. The choice had been taken away. It was now or never, and never meant watching your men get overrun on a live radio feed. The sound of that final desperate plea was like a physical blow, jolting everyone out of their trance. Whatever doubt Sergeant Miller might have had was vaporized in that instant. His face, which had been a mask of concentration and stress, became a terrifying blank slate of pure, unadulterated resolve. There was no more thought, only action. His hand didn't just turn the key, it slammed down on it and twisted, with a ferocity that I thought would snap the metal. The motion was violent, decisive, and utterly final. He was pouring every ounce of his fear, his anger, and his last desperate shred of hope into that one single mechanical action. It was a prayer made of force and will, a demand sent directly from a man's soul to the cold, dead heart of the machine. He was no longer trying to start an engine, he was trying to command a resurrection. The first sound was a horrible, soul-crushing groan. It was the noise of seized metal, of an engine that had no intention of ever moving again. It was followed by a wet, sickly cough, and then a series of pathetic sputters. The lights on the dashboard flickered weakly, once, and then died again. My stomach dropped. I could feel a collective sigh of despair ripple through the soldiers who had gathered around. It was over. The kid was wrong. The miracle hadn't come. I risked a glance at the engineers, and the smirk I had seen earlier was now a full-blown, triumphant grin on one of their faces. They were already nodding to each other, their superiority confirmed. It was a bitter, ugly moment, the air thick with the taste of failure and the quiet satisfaction of the arrogant. But Leo didn't move a muscle. He hadn't flinched at the sound, he hadn't looked away. He just stood there, his small frame perfectly still, his eyes locked on the engine block as if he were still listening to it. His expression was unchanged, a mask of calm, intense focus. It was the most unnerving thing in the entire bay. While the rest of us were riding a roller coaster of hope and despair, he was an island of absolute certainty. It was as if he had expected this initial failure. He knew this stubborn beast wouldn't wake up gently. It needed to be fought, to be coaxed and wrestled back to life. His stillness was a silent message to Miller. Don't stop. It's not over yet. Miller must have seen it too, or maybe he was just running on pure blind refusal to accept defeat. He didn't let go of the key. He kept it twisted to the braking point, and with his other foot, he started pumping the accelerator. He was flooding the engine, an act of mechanical heresy that would make any trained mechanic scream. It was a brute force attack, born of nothing but a refusal to let his men die. A huge cloud of thick, black, oily smoke belched from the exhaust pipe, filling the bay with a choking, acrid smell. It was the engine's death rattle, its final, smoky protest before giving up the ghost for good. The engineers were openly laughing now, shaking their heads at the sheer, unprofessional incompetence of it all. And then, it happened. From deep within the cloud of black smoke and the sounds of mechanical torture, there was a new noise. A single clean ignition. A spark. It was followed by another, and another, like a series of gunshots. The entire chassis of the Bulldog shuddered violently, and then, with a sound that ripped through the air and shook the concrete floor beneath our feet, the engine roared to life. It wasn't a sputter or a cough. It was a sudden, deafening, perfectly tuned roar of pure, unrestrained power. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The noise was a physical force, a shockwave of victory that slammed into all of us, wiping the smirks off the engineers' faces and replacing them with a look of stunned, slack-jawed disbelief. The Bulldog was alive. The roar was not just a sound, it was a physical event. It slammed into us, a wave of pure concussive force that vibrated up from the concrete floor and into our bones. The air, thick with black smoke just moments before, was now clean and sharp with the smell of perfectly combusted diesel. Every single person in that bay flinched, not from fear but from sheer overwhelming shock. The engineers, who had been openly grinning at the failure, were frozen in place, their mouths hanging open. Their faces were a perfect picture of cognitive dissonance, their brains utterly failing to reconcile the impossible reality with the data from their precious laptops. The Bulldog wasn't just running, it was screaming its defiance at them, a thunderous declaration that their expertise meant nothing. In that one moment, a 12-year-old orphan had shattered their entire world. Inside the cabin, Sergeant Miller didn't hesitate. He wasn't just checking if the engine was running, he was celebrating its resurrection. He slammed his foot on the accelerator again and again, and the engine responded with a series of deep guttural roars that echoed off the metal walls of the bay like thunder. It was a war cry. It was a hymn of gratitude. Through the dusty windshield, I saw his eyes find Leo. He didn't smile or shout. He just locked his gaze on the boy, and in that silent, intense stare, a lifetime of thanks was exchanged. It was a look that said, "You did it. You saved them. You saved me." For the first time, Miller wasn't looking at a street kid or a nuisance. He was looking at the single most important person in his entire world. The spell was broken by Miller's voice, now a booming command that cut through the engine's roar. "Ramp down! Let's go! Let's go! Richards, Peterson, grab your kits! Move!" The bay exploded into purposeful, frantic motion. The soldiers who had been standing around as helpless spectators were now a flurry of activity, grabbing ammo cans, medical bags, and their rifles. The despair that had hung over us like a shroud was incinerated by the heat of the engine and the fire in Miller's commands. Hope was no longer a fragile, flickering candle. It was a roaring inferno. The men were moving with a speed and ferocity I hadn't seen before, driven by the impossible chance they had just been given. They were going to get their brothers back. Amidst all this renewed chaos, Leo remained perfectly still. He just stood there, a small, solitary figure in the center of the storm he had created, watching. The soldiers scrambled aboard the Bulldog. He didn't seem to want or need any acknowledgement. His face held no triumph, no "I told you so." There was only a quiet, solemn focus as he watched the machine he had healed prepare for its violent purpose. It was as if he had a deep personal connection to the engine itself, and his only concern was that it performed its duty. He had mended its broken heart, and now he was watching it go off to war. In his eyes, you could see the profound understanding of a creator watching his creation fulfill its destiny. The engineers were completely broken. They were like statues, their faces pale under the harsh bay lights. Chief Davis's lieutenants, the ones who had been snickering, now looked like they'd seen a ghost. One of them, a young specialist who always bragged about his certifications, took a few hesitant steps towards the roaring MRAP. He reached out a trembling hand and placed it on the vibrating chassis, as if needing physical proof that this wasn't some mass hallucination. He wasn't checking diagnostics. He was touching a miracle. All their training, all their manuals, all their arrogant certainties had been rendered utterly meaningless by a boy with a piece of wire and an intuitive understanding of how things work. They weren't just wrong, they were irrelevant. With a final deafening roar, the Bulldog lurched forward. The heavy vehicle surged out of the maintenance bay with a power that felt unstoppable, kicking up a storm of dust and gravel. As it passed, Sergeant Miller, his face a grim mask of determination, gave a short, sharp nod directly to Leo. It was a soldier's salute, a gesture of ultimate respect from one warrior to another. The rear ramp was still closing as the MRAP cleared the gate, its taillights disappearing into the swirling dust. Then we heard Miller's voice, clear and hard over the base-wide radio network, a transmission of pure salvation. "Hold fast, Echo 2. The Bulldog is on the move. We are coming to get you." The sound wasn't just a promise, it was a prophecy being fulfilled. The thunder of the engine faded into the distance, leaving a ringing silence in the bay. We all just stood there, breathing in the lingering fumes of diesel and victory. The air was thick with the unreality of what we had just witnessed. Everyone's eyes, from the lowest private to the stunned engineers, were on Leo. He was no longer a shadow in the corner. He was the center of this new, altered reality. He stood there, covered in grease and dust, and for the first time he looked up and met my gaze. He didn't smile, but for a fleeting second I saw something in his old eyes that wasn't there before. Not pride, but belonging. He had fixed more than an engine that day. He had fixed his own place in our world. An hour later the Bulldog returned. It didn't just drive back through the gate. It was a rolling victory parade, covered in dust and a few new dings, but very much alive. The ramp lowered, and Miller's men stumbled out, exhausted, bleeding, but whole. They looked like men who had stared into the abyss and been pulled back at the last possible second. As they were being led to the medical tent, one of them, the corporal whose voice we'd heard on the radio, stopped. He saw Leo standing near me, and his tired, grimy face broke into a look of pure, unadulterated reverence. He walked over, knelt down on one knee despite his injuries, and just looked at the boy. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. We all understood. He was thanking a God he never knew existed until today. We never saw Chief Warrant Officer Davis again. Not really. Later that night, I saw him loading his gear into a transport chopper, moving under the cover of darkness. He didn't speak to anyone. His team of engineers, the ones who had laughed, avoided eye contact with everyone, packing up their advanced diagnostic tools with a new, humbling silence. Davis's arrogance had been his entire identity, and Leo had stripped it. away with a piece of wire. He didn't get court-martialed or formally disciplined, at least not that we ever heard. He just vanished. His reputation, once his shield, had become a shroud. He was transferred out before sunrise, a ghost haunted not by failure, but by the irrefutable proof that he had been completely and utterly wrong when it mattered most. That evening, I saw Sergeant Miller sitting on an ammo crate, sharing his MRE, his own meal, with Leo. He had a real plate for the boy, not just a pouch. He'd found him a clean blanket and a cot in the corner of his own quarters, away from the dust and the noise. He was talking to him quietly, not like a soldier to a local, but like a father to a son. He was asking him about the old tractors, about the water pumps, about the things his father had taught him. He was listening. For the first time, someone was actually listening to Leo, not for an answer to a desperate problem, but just to hear his voice. In that small circle of lamplight, a new family was being forged, built on a foundation of grease, desperation, and profound gratitude. Leo became a legend. The soldiers started calling him the Bulldog's Whisperer, or the Guardian of the Motor Pool. It wasn't a joke, it was a title of respect. Mechanics, men twice his age with years of training, would quietly seek him out before starting a complex repair. They wouldn't ask for orders, but they'd say something like, "Hey, Leo, come listen to this for a second, will ya?" Something. "Doesn't sound right to me." And Leo would come, place his small hand on the engine block, close his eyes, and just listen. He never spoke much, just a nod or a finger pointed at a vibrating hose or a loose belt. He had a place now. He had a purpose. He was no longer the invisible boy in the corner. He was the quiet, beating heart of our entire motor pool. A few days later, the base commander came down to the bay. It wasn't a formal ceremony with speeches or formations. He walked right up to Leo, who was helping a mechanic clean a set of spark plugs. The commander, a man we all feared and respected, knelt down just like the rescued corporal had. He didn't say much. He just looked Leo in the eye and said, "We don't give medals for miracles, son, but we do recognize family." Then he reached up, tore the unit patch from the sleeve of his own uniform, a sacred symbol of brotherhood and belonging, and pressed it firmly into Leo's small hand. He closed the boy's fingers over it. "You're one of us now," he said. "Welcome home." Leo just stared at the patch, his eyes shining, finally understanding he wasn't alone anymore. That day changed everything. It wasn't just about a fixed engine or a rescued patrol. It was a shift in the soul of the entire base. We started to learn that sometimes the most sophisticated tools aren't the ones that plug into a wall. We learned that the most important knowledge isn't always found in a manual. In the middle of all that dust and chaos, we all learned that true expertise doesn't wear a uniform or come with a rank. Sometimes it's found in the quiet, steady hands of a 12-year-old boy who simply knew how to listen to what the machine and what hope was trying to say all along. It's a lesson none of us who were there have ever forgotten. I think back on that day a lot. It wasn't just about saving Sergeant Miller's men, though that was a miracle in itself. It was about what we all learned. We were so caught up in our advanced technology, our manuals and our rigid chains of command that we had forgotten how to just listen. We believed in diagnostics and data more than we believed in our own eyes and instincts. That engine wasn't just a machine, it was a symbol of our own arrogance. We declared it dead because a computer told us so, while a boy with nothing but his hands and his focus knew it just needed to be woken up. It forced every single one of us to question what expertise really means, and whether the loudest voice in the room is ever the one worth listening to. The bond that formed between Sergeant Miller and Leo was something special. It went beyond gratitude. Miller, a man who lived his life by the book, had thrown the book away in a moment of sheer desperation and found something far more reliable: human intuition. He saw in Leo a reflection of a purer kind of knowledge, something the army could never teach him. He didn't treat Leo like a son he was adopting out of pity. He treated him like a partner he respected. He'd sit with him for hours, not teaching but learning, asking Leo to explain the sounds of the generators, the hum of the water purifiers. He was learning a new language, the language of the machine, taught by a 12-year-old master. I guess the reason this story sticks with me so much is because I think there's a little bit of Leo in all of us. We all have that one thing we understand instinctively, that quiet talent that doesn't fit into a box or look good on a resume. And we've All faced a Chief Davis, some authority figure who dismisses our ideas because we don't have the right credentials or the proper title. They laugh at our simple solutions while they fail with their complex ones. That day taught me that your worth isn't determined by the people who refuse to see it. It's defined by those moments when you trust yourself, even when no one else does, and you step out of the shadows to point at the one thing everyone else has missed. People on the base called what? Leo did a miracle, but it wasn't. A miracle is something you can't explain. What Leo did was the exact opposite. It was a masterclass in paying attention. The answer was right there the whole time, a tiny valve clogged with sand. It was a problem so simple, so mundane, that the experts in their arrogance couldn't even conceive of it. They were looking for a catastrophic failure because their ego demanded a complex problem. Leo just looked for what was actually wrong. It's a humbling reminder that sometimes the biggest problems have the smallest solutions, and they're usually hidden in plain sight waiting for someone humble enough to look for them. If you know someone who needs to hear this message of self-confidence, please share this video with that person. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about finding your own path, even when it's not what others expect. I share these because I believe that in every story of being underestimated, there's a lesson in strength that we can all learn from. Thank you for listening, for being a part of this, and for remembering that sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one holding the answer that can save everyone.